changes in older men's employment. So from the mid-70s to the mid-90s, and even before that, really, older men, the employment of men aged 55 to 64 declined dramatically. So from the mid-70s and mid-90s, on average, more than 15 percentage points in kind of a representative set of OECD countries, only to basically rebound to almost as much since the mid-90s. And so it's really kind of interesting to try to understand what's going on. And there's, of course, the decline has largely been in the literature attributed to increases in incomes and expansions of Social Security. And those trends have operated alongside improvements in health and longevity and education, which counter those depleting forces and actually push up employment. The interesting thing is that there's no real obvious trend break in any of these factors, with the possible exception of Social Security. And so what we really think is going on is that yes, there's been these secular forces operating, these long-run forces operating all along, but in the 70s and 80s that was compounded by kind of negative shocks to the labor market that affected all age groups, but that got amplified among the older individuals due to what we term shadow Social Security programs. Programs that kind of form a bridge into retirement that operate prior to the statutory retirement age. And then many of these programs have then subsequently been rolled back from the mid-90s when we see kind of this, the employment rate starting to rise.
Population aging is already pushed the median age in the OECD countries to, on average, 40. And we've already seen some of the OECD countries been aging rapidly, such as Germany, Japan, Korea, etc. And so the fact that we have many more older workers in the labor force and in the workplace, we need to make sure that we embrace the age diversity and the benefits that could bring to individual societies and economies as a whole. Looking at some work that we've done at the OECD, we look at the ratio of number of inactive individuals aged 50 and over, and by inactive I mean people that are not in the labor force either because they have retired early or they are no longer active in the labor force. Comparing their ratio to per 100 worker, that is set to increase dramatically. So essentially the number of people that are working compared to people that are outside of the labor force is going to rise dramatically. And so that essentially is going to undermine the living standards that we've all achieved across the several decades in the OECD countries, but also substantially put further pressure on public pensions, as well as health expenditures as we see swelling elderly population in the economies. I think the pattern across the rich world is pretty similar. Of course, there are some countries that are still, for example, like the US and Australia, where the pace of aging is happening at a slower than see what's happened in Japan already. So there are different effects. But I think what's important is to take a life cycle approach, because current generations or younger individuals are also set to become older. And so we need to think about policies and put in place policies that are going to ensure healthy aging and active aging for these groups.
I think I totally agree with Shruti that this is going to be an increasing problem, and we're going to want to retain these older individuals in the labor market. I guess part of me also thinks there's room for higher employment in some countries, certainly, even given the existing landscape, right? I mean, I think if I remember off the top of my head, I think currently of 60 to 64-year-old men in France, only about a third are working. So there's certainly scope, I think, even without major accommodations, to hopefully try to stimulate this group, maybe through policies and stuff. So I think that's one element. Then the other is, how does the workplace need to adapt to the aging, and how do we retain them even longer and even in greater numbers? And I think flexibility is going to be key. I think there's studies suggest, when we survey individuals, there's evidence suggesting that more people would like to work if they could reduce their hours or have other greater degrees of flexibility. So I think that's one on the supply side, in terms of just getting people to want to work. I think flexibility is going to be important.
I think Johanna has already spoken quite substantially about the transition governments went through, reforming their early retirement schemes and also unemployment benefits and disability benefits that in the past have served as a sort of a tunnel towards early retirement. So that's one side, to give incentives, financial incentives to for people to stay as long as they are able to in the labour force. But there's also the labour demand, and I think that's where the skills fits in. It's the key. We want to also improve the employability of workers. And I think when it comes to older ages in particular, there's a very strong perception and myth, the fact that productivity declines as we age. And so it's a bit of a vicious circle, because on one hand we have these strong perceptions and myths, so employers don't invest in older workers. The investment often is seen not as being fruitful, because they have
won't pay off enough
won't pay off because there isn't enough time spent left in the working lives. But at the same time, we need skills to offset some of the productivity declines that may come for some older workers as they age. Especially when we see across OECD countries, there's a huge inequality between the access to or participation in training between younger counterparts, younger individuals compared to older workers. So we really need to close that the training divide, or the digital divide, which is going to be even more important given that we have automation and likely to see more of the job growth happening in sectors that are going to be demanding digital skills. Absolutely. There are numerous countries that are already responding to the challenges. And just to give you an example, I think Australia is quite a front runner in some respects. They have very interesting programs, something called the skills checkpoint, that is already given to workers at the age of 45, in the hope that that's going to serve as a basis to understand what are the deficits in people's skills. What sort of skills do they need to stay in their current jobs, but also help them transition to new occupations. So I think that's a very interesting program that's come about 2 years ago. And similarly, there's a lot of interesting programs, across the OECD that are popping up, more around how do we improve the financial incentives for employers to make it worthwhile for them to invest in older workers. At the same time, there's also, in fact, sometimes we see older workers themselves do not want to participate in training because they lack the time, lack the financial resources to do so. And so there's a lot of subsidies and financial incentives to given to individuals to take part in training as well.
I do think that work is an important dimension, and I think that there's just a lot of human capital, and this is what Shruti was saying too, right? It's not. I mean, of course, certain people slow down and they get worse at performing certain tasks, but there's tremendous human capital that one accumulates, and we don't want to give up on that. So I think there's a lot of positives too, not just a matter of making accommodations or something like this, but tapping into that potential. But I think one thing to keep in mind, of course, is the inequality that there's huge. There's a huge socioeconomic gradient to health and longevity, and these gaps seem to be widening, and so we're going to have to be mindful of that, whether it's with pension reform or thinking about how to adapt the labor market.
And the OECD, we do a lot of research, of course, ourselves, and the advantage we have is that we can draw on these cross-country comparisons. And And I think we researchers, and forums like this are incredibly important. And I think what's been fantastic about today is the fact that the diversity of different professionals we have in the room. We have scientists talking together with labor economists, but also with health economists. And I think it's important that we engage with as many different stakeholders as possible on a topic that is affecting all of us on such a large scale. And I think we need to go beyond that. The research needs to be disseminated, taken forward to employers. Employers have increasingly and a very important role on people's well-being, but also on the employment of older workers. And none of the policies, in fact, lies in their hands. So I think earlier I referred to the fact that there's a lot of perception about people's productivity, etc. And I think we need to take that research, involve different stakeholders, involving employers and trade unions as well.